Alrighty.
I thought it
Here we
said
go.
deep
Pay attention,
fried.
please.
Why is Campbell looking at her back?
So the first biome we're going to look at are grasslands. Actually, there's several of them based upon mainly their latitude of where you find them. They are semi-arid, which means what? Semi-dry. Semi-dry. So they're they get a little bit more precipitation than the deserts. So it's enough to support grasses, but not enough to support trees. That's the kind of the defining characteristic of them. And with this, as we shall see with the rest of your biomes, they have examples typically in all three geographical latitude zones, we'll call them: tropical, temperate, and polar. And we'll go ahead and split that up 30, 60, 90. Although that's not exactly right, but that's easier to remember. So 30 degrees above and below, or north and south of the equator, that's going to be tropical. 30 to 60 will be your temperate zone, and 60 to 90 will be your polar zone. Okay. So savannas are your tropical grassland. This is what you think of, or this is what when you think of the African plain with the lions and the zebras and the elephants and all that kind of stuff out there. That's a tropical savanna. Huge populations of grazing herbivores, because they do have grass year-round that's present. Now, here's the thing. Grass is, as an ecosystem, grasslands as an ecosystem are not as productive as forests. Okay, trees actually are carrying out more photosynthesis, taking in more carbon dioxide, so their gross primary productivity is greater, but more of the grass is eaten. So think about it. When things graze upon grass, they eat all of it for the most part, except for the roots and everything, of course. Whereas with trees, you get some things that are eating the leaves and things. With some trees, like your evergreen type coniferous trees, very little of that is actually edible. So there's much more in these types of grasslands that's passed from the producer level to the consumer level, and therefore that's why you can see so much biomass. And it's literally an indication of that transfer is how big the things you have out here. You've got elephants and thousands of wildebeest and zebras and all kinds of things. So you've got a huge amount of primary consumer biomass that these particular ones support, much more than your typical tropical rainforest as far as grazing, a lot more developed animals. You can argue that if you look at insects and stuff in the rainforest, but we'll keep focused on that and the reason why. And so you have two rainy seasons also. That makes this particular type of grassland, tropical type, more productive than your other type. As far as human impact, it's mostly happened in the case of overgrazing. A lot of developing nations in these particular areas have turned to raising cattle for income and to eat as well themselves. And although that would seem like a good match because their cattle are grazing herbivores, they're not ones that are adapted to actually life in that particular area, and they need more water. And so consequently, and they've been used, not only they're not that well adapted, they've simply put too many animals in one particular per hectare of land, and therefore they have overgrazed in many areas to the point where you have desertification. I talked about this before a little bit. We looked at livestock impact, hopefully you remember, and when you get too many in one area, they will eat the grass down to the roots, and it'll kill the grass, and then the soil's exposed, and when the soil's exposed in a grassland area, it'll dry out quickly and blow away, and you'll have a desert instead of a grassland anymore. So that's your savanna or tropical grassland. The next are prairies. I'll take plains. I mean, it's not exactly right, but it's pretty close. That is the area where you find them. Prairies. And these are the type that you would find in your temperate areas, like in the Midwest or the plains states, plains regions of the United States and Canada. They've also got extensive areas in Europe and Russia, Asia, and those areas. They used to support massive grazing herds, buffalo in some areas as well, so I'll go ahead and give you a point for that. The ones,
Buffalo is
the
a bison.
ones that you find in America
American buffalo
are
and or bison.
bison. Okay.
Are they like almost extinct?
No, actually they made a pretty good
haven't
comeback.
already
Bison made a pretty good comeback. As a matter of fact,
researched.
you can eat them. You can buy them. The people farm them now.
Like currently?
Yeah.
What do you have?
Cool.
Now, here's the thing about this. Because they are in temperate latitudes, listen up, they do die back every year during the winter. And therefore they, and also they have, frequently have fires because of the wind. That's a big factor. Temperate areas, temperate regions, you know, they have more wind than you do in tropical regions. And so that feeds fires and flames. So frequent fires and annual dieback produce deep,
Fried soil.
topsoil. Very deep topsoil. Sometimes upwards of 9 to 10 feet deep. So the topsoil builds up because the grasses die back and then a new layer grows on top of that. You know, they have that matted web-like structure, etc. And so because of that, and because they're typically very flat and they don't usually have a lot of rocks and stuff in them, much of these around the world have been converted into agriculture. Mostly, you know, crops, grain crops, wheat, corn, rice. Well, I think of it. Rice, not so much. Rice is a flooded crop, so rice is not really grown that much in these types of areas, but certainly wheat and corn. And also, of course, we do some ranging and pasture, you know, use it for grazing livestock as well. Human impact. Now, here's the thing. The term habitat destruction has kind of fallen out of favor a little bit. It's being less used because, I mean, when a lot of times when people go in and they do things, they cut down a forest or whatever else, seems like they destroyed it, but they may either plant something back in again, or they may just cut it down to get the wood out and then let it go and let it regrow itself. So they haven't completely destroyed that habitat unless, of course, they've just paved paradise kind of thing, and nothing will grow there afterwards. So even if you change it and put a crop in, you still have an ecosystem there. And so we're calling that habitat alteration. Is a more favorable term as opposed to habitat destruction now. And so that's what has been done historically quite a bit throughout time, Europe and everything. And what we find, you know, what you see is that you have a lot of environmental impact in your temperate areas around the world. We'll look at how the forests that used to cover much of the temperate latitudes and everything in the world have been destroyed, because that's where most of your industrialization and civilization advanced in those areas of populations throughout Europe and then later, of course, in the United States. Another big thing that has had happened much more recently, but is communism in China and Russia and Soviet Union. That's what it used to be, where they committed large groups of people to farm wheat and rice with the government's goal to produce excess enough they could sell it. But it was a huge amount of over-farming and stuff, and of course they converted a lot of these prairie-type lands into crops. So you have that. You have the habitat alteration that changes that, of course, and then you know what your different effects of pollution of agriculture, such as fertilizer runoff and pesticides and all that kind of stuff, are as far as human impact of these types of regions. Any questions about grasslands of savannas and prairies? Alrighty then, 1, 6, 3, 5.
And 2.
Alright, so your polar grasslands are often called the tundra. Grasses are still the main primary producer, but this is one of the few major ecosystems where you see a lot of mosses. Now, if it had trees would be a forest. So grasslands do not. They do, like the savanna has some trees, but typically the characteristic is that they have very few, if any, trees. And the same is true of the tundra. Of course, the cold is a big issue there with as far as trees growing. They also it doesn't get much precipitation at those latitudes. If you remember the way the air flows and stuff, you're getting into a high pressure region there. And also something called permafrost limits the growth of trees in these areas. So that's not one of your major primary producers in the tundra, but you do get grasses, mosses, and small shrubs. The consumers are adapted to cold weather, so the animals, etc., by doing several things or having several characteristics, such as hibernating. They adapt thick coats and put on layers of fat to help insulate them. And you'll find a lot of burrowing mammals in this particular type of habitat because, of course, if you burrow, you can get down and avoid the cold by doing that, and those types of carnivores that eat from those. Like I said, your permafrost is a feature of this particular ecosystem. That's a layer of ice that never completely thaws out during the summer. It's usually about 6 feet or so under the surface of the soil, and of course that means that you're not going to be able to, larger plants, etc., not going to be able to root down into the soil past there. And it also melts during the summer, and you get a wetland area in these particular areas. As a matter of fact, a lot of mosquitoes and other biting flies and stuff breed in that area when that happens, and people are surprised when they go into areas that are tundra or very cold. It's still cold in the summer, relatively speaking, maybe 60s or so, but there's big swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies, and it surprises a lot of people, but they have them. Human impacts has not been huge in a lot of areas like it has been in your more temperate and tropical areas. It's simply because it's too cold really to raise crops, and of course it's no fun to live there either. But there are plenty of areas where there's minerals that are available, including fossil fuels. And one in particular is known as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And this is an area in Alaska that has been debated back and forth over the decades about whether or not we should drill for oil there. Right now, since it's a refuge, no oil drilling or other mineral rights extraction is allowed, but people have been proposing it because apparently geologists have said there's some pretty decent sized petroleum deposits under the ground there. One of the things that, as far as human impact goes, however, is that when we do have some impact on the environment, is it doesn't recuperate very quickly. It doesn't recover very quickly because it's so cold, and you don't have a lot of primary productivity to regrow stuff, and you also don't have you have slow decomposition rates, which makes it harder for ecosystems to recover as they're waiting to get their nutrients back into the soil and stuff, and start the whole growing process again. It takes longer in this type of environment. All right, and then finally, last bullet here, deserts. They occur at all temperatures. I'm going to go ahead and take that group too, because that's the idea of it. What I was actually looking for here was latitudes. And a lot of people think of deserts only as being hot, but that is not correct. The main thing that defines them is that they have low precipitation, generally less than 20 centimeters a year. Okay, many climatologists classify Antarctica as a desert because it gets very little precipitation. But the Gobi Desert, as was mentioned earlier in China, is a very cold desert. It gets down to I think 60, 70 below. It's very high. It's on the plateau that's on the north side of the Himalaya mountains. So that explains a lot about the temperature conditions there and everything. But it is a desert. It has very little precipitation because it's all blocked by the Himalayas there and everything, and therefore it is a desert, although it's very cold. Things in the community, so when I say the community, I mean both plants and animals and other organisms there are going to adapt, of course, to low water conditions by minimizing the water loss, by having periods, particularly with plants, where they can go dormant. Although there is a species of toad that lives in the desert that actually can go into a state of suspended animation for like 2 years, where it's basically almost not living. And again, of course, it's an amphibian, so it needs water. It needs a fair amount of water. But I guess it can get down deep enough, in other words, there's a little bit of moisture there, and stay packed in, and then when it rains and floods again, it reanimates. It comes back to life. But that's an example, of course, of being dormant. But we also looked at the desert blooms, right? We showed you those videos, right? If I didn't, remind me to. But it's basically, you have a lot of plants that, deserts will get rain maybe once a year or every other year or something like that. And when they do, there's lots of seeds and stuff in the ground that were left from the last time that happened, and you have plants there that will grow very rapidly in that short time period where the soil's wet, flower, reproduce, make their seeds, drop them, and then they're going to die off, of course, but they have done their job and they have made the next generation. And so when that flood comes again, voila, you've got life again. So those are some of the ways in which organisms in the desert adapt. Of course, like cactuses have spines instead of leaves. Leaves are where water comes out. Nocturnal animals, as you might imagine, they can escape the desert heat. It gets pretty cold, actually, in the desert at night, usually down 30s or 40s, even in a hot desert, because there's no water to hold the heat in. Human impact is also, once again, from mining. And you have soil salinization. Hopefully you remember that. In areas where it's normally desert, but you may have high populations, particularly like in the Middle East, where they got a lot of money from oil and stuff, but they're still living in a desert, but they still want to have crops and food, so they will either desalinate, which doesn't completely desalinate it, or use deep aquifer water or whatever else. And there's a lot of soil salinization that comes from that. If you remember, using other than precipitation sources for your crops of water, well, eventually will lead the soil to get real salty from there. And apparently recreational vehicles, ATVs, cause a lot of damage in the desert. At least your book seems to be concerned with that, but that's also been an issue of a political issue out in the West in the United States. There's a lot of ecologists that are angry and picketing people that are doing dirt bikes and ATVs and stuff like that. So, because they run over the cactuses and things like that. And it's also, you have to remember that this, like the tundra, this is not a very productive ecosystem. Stuff grows slow in it. When you do damage to it, it's going to take a long time for it to recover. Any questions about the desert? All right.